My name is Snow, and I'm on a journey to teach you model making for VRChat. Join me on the path to learning Blender, Unity, and more. Interested? Let's go. Hello and welcome to our first introductory episode on specifically Blender this time around. We're not going to dive into any other software, but we're going to take a look at Blender. This series is going to consist of fairly short, fairly concise, and fairly comprehensive videos on how to use Blender, what tools you have at your disposal, and how to actually use these tools. Now, today, we're going to go through the controls that you need in order to navigate Blender, the shortcuts, some of the easy to learn, quick shortcuts, because they will save you quite a lot of time, believe you me. And we're also going to dive into some of the tools that we'll be using for creating the models for VRChat, whether that's for sculpting or for way painting. We're not going to go into depth about them, but we're going to point them out to show you what is actually available to you. And last but not least, we'll take a look at what the Cats plugin provides for you and how you can get it, how you can install it. But without further ado, let's dive in. So first question you might have is, what is Blender? Blender is a 3D modeling software, and it can do a lot more than just create 3D models. It can create models that are completely game ready. It can create, you can draw in it, you can edit videos, you can do point tracking for video footage, so you can input 3D objects into 2D movies. You can do a lot in Blender, but we're not going to look at most of it. We're going to be interested only in certain small aspects of Blender that will help us create VRChat avatars, or at least put avatars together. Maybe down the line, we'll explore actually modeling things, like creating clothing or creating base meshes for avatars, but that is going to be a learning process for both me and you, as my modeling skills are basic at best. So it would be a very interesting journey to go on together if we ever do. But first and foremost, what do we have? We need to know how to get Blender. And getting Blender, there are two ways. Way number one, if you go to blender.org, which I will provide the links in the description to everything that I'm discussing and everything I'm telling you about. If you go to blender.org, you can simply download Blender. It will give you the newest version, and you can just install it and be up and running. And if you've ever installed a piece of software before, this is no different. There's nothing extra to checkmark. You don't need to worry about it. Blender installs everything by itself completely, so just hit next on everything and you'll be just fine. For those of you who are a little bit more interested in keeping everything updated and not having to update Blender yourself, though, because Blender doesn't have its own launcher per se to update itself, and you'll have to do it manually every single time, you can also download Blender on Steam. Now, Blender on Steam will come with the newest version and will update itself to the newest version every single time, which means some of your plugins might break as Blender updates. So it's entirely up to you whether you want to take this chance, this step, and actually have more or less a launcher for Blender, and how much you actually want to learn Blender so that you don't need to rely as much on plugins and can just do a lot of the things yourself. But you can download Blender from Steam and it will auto-update itself, and it will work just fine. So for the time being, let's pretend that you've installed Blender. Let's take a look. Now, I use Blender through Steam, so let's go ahead and launch it. Welcome to Blender. Now, this is the default way Blender will open for you, and there are ways to customize Blender, and if that's something that you're interested in, leave a comment below, but you can customize Blender exactly for your needs. You can move things around, you can change locations, you can add, you can remove windows, and some of the features I'll go through today, but there's some more in-depth stuff like shortcuts and actual positioning of certain buttons that you can change and to make it more comfortable for yourself or whatnot. But for the time being, welcome to Blender. This is what it's going to look like, except your recent files will have nothing in it. For now, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to make it a general file. In this case, it already created one for us, so I'm just going to click off of the window and it's going to close, and this is our general scene. We have a camera, we have a cube, and we have a light. And normally these things are going to be completely unnecessary and you can delete all three of them and not worry about it anymore. But for now, we're actually going to take a look at how do we control Blender. As you can probably notice, the window is quite overwhelming. There's a lot of things going on and there's a lot of little tabs and whatnot, and we won't go through every single one of them, but we will touch up on quite a few of them that will help you with model creation, and that will aid you in certain things. Now, first and foremost, how do we move around Blender? Your main source of movement is going to be your middle click. Your middle click will rotate the camera around the object that you have selected. Now, if you have a number pad, you can choose which object you have selected and which object is your primary focus. I don't have a number pad, so it would be a little bit harder to show, but if you click on an object and press period on your number pad, it will actually zoom in to the object that you have selected, and it will allow you to pan around that object. In my case, I have to go through a few menus, but in most cases, I just do everything manually, and I'm working around this area anyways, so it's not a big deal to have to like really pay attention to one single object. Now, as you saw just now, scrolling will allow you to zoom in and out. The closer you zoom, the less you'll be able to move the camera, which basically means the closer you are, Blender tries to compensate for the fact that you're nice and zoomed into an object, and it will actually slow down your movement around and left and right and back and forth a little bit, just to compensate for the fact that you're very, very close to something. This is very useful when you're working on a very small area. For example, this point right here. If I was completely zoomed out, I'd be able to move a large area. But if I'm zoomed in, the same amount of movement with my mouse will not translate. So if you're ever, zoomed in into a model so far that it barely shifts left and right, and you're wondering why, well, it's probably because you don't have that model centered or selected, and you can just hit period on the model and it will zoom you out, and you can zoom in and it will reset itself a little bit. Now, the shift key is going to be quite important for a lot of things in our cases, because there's a lot of shortcuts that will require the shift and the control key. But then first and foremost, the main shortcut you should learn is hold down shift, press the middle mouse button, and pan your camera around. Now, this doesn't rotate our camera like regular middle click. This moves our camera all the way around. And these three actions of rotation, movement, and zoom in and zoom out are our main actions for navigating around our object, whatever it is, whether it's a model or a cube in this case. Now, with that all settled, let's talk certain things that we'll be accessing in Blender and a few shortcuts associated with them. In quite a few cases, we're going to need to go into an edit mode, and I'll go into more depth what an edit mode is down the line as we get to the point where we need to use edit mode. But edit mode can be accessed by coming here where it says object mode, dropping down the menu and clicking edit mode. Now, that's a lot of work to get into a mode that we'll be using quite often, as a matter of fact, because this is what allows us to move our individual vertices around instead of the whole object. right? And we'll be switching between edit mode and object mode, as they have, as you can see, very different functions. Things change and things move around, we get different things. And even if we right click, we get certain context menus, and we get a completely different context menu here in object mode. We need to learn how to switch between these two modes very quickly. And the best way to do it is your tab key. Your tab key switches you between object mode and edit mode. In some cases, if you're doing something like sculpting, your tab key will switch you from sculpting mode back to edit mode, back to sculpting mode. So you'll have to manually go here and switch back to object. Now there is a shortcut for it, but for now, let's keep that in mind. But tab will switch you between the two modes. It's going to switch you into edit mode and out of it. And wherever you were before, it will switch you back to that. So whether it's sculpting or painting or object mode in this case. That's going to be quite useful. Now, another thing we have is a little toolbar here. This toolbar has quite a few tools. Now, our cursor, we're not going to worry too much about. The cursor is something that we'll keep static, and it's mostly for actually 3D modeling, and that's something we can go into in the future, and it allows you to anchor where your objects are. We're not going to touch the cursor almost at all during our tutorials for all of this. And then we have our move tool, rotate tool, and scale tool. Now, our move, if we click on our move tool, we get a little, I guess, compass. And if you've ever used any kind of software like this, this compass is going to look extremely familiar, where you can grab an arrow and move it around along an axis, right? But you can also click on a square and it will move it along two axes, but not along another. And this is great. Clicking here and doing that is fantastic until you realize that, well, if I want to rotate, I have to click on rotate, and then I have to select certain things. And if I want to move it again, I have to click on move it and move certain things. We do have shortcuts for both of these. Now, one of them is a bit unintuitive, and I'm going to go back to our selection mode. One of them is a little unintuitive. G is your key for moving stuff around. I don't know why it's G. I guess it's for grab, but G for grab to move your stuff around, to move your objects around, and this is going to be extremely useful. Now, another thing you should learn immediately and as soon as possible is if you press G and then you press any of the axes. So as you learned in math class, there's X, Y, and Z axes. So if we select the X axis, and as we have the object grab with G and press X, it will only let us move along the X axis. If we press Z, it will only let us move along the Z axis. And if we press Y, it will let us move along the Y axis. And you can mix and match these with Shift and only have two axes available to move the object around in. But if you just want to freely move an object around, you can just press G and it will move around wherever you want, obviously within reason. Now, as you saw, as I'm moving the object around, it's snapping back to where it is. And that's because I am pressing right click. Right click cancels any action that you're doing when it comes to moving an object or rotating an object. So if I rotate an object and I don't like it, if I want to try again, I don't have to set this rotation. I can just right click and it'll reset back to how it was before the action occurred. And I can try again. I can try rotating it again, however I like. Now, let's move on to rotation. Rotation is R. As G for grab, R for rotate. So if we click R, it will let us rotate our object. And same thing applies as with moving. So if we press on the Z-axis, we can only rotate around the Z-axis. If we press the X-axis, only around the X-axis. And if we press the Y-axis, we can only do the Y rotation. Quite simple, quite easy. And that's basically our manipulation of objects, and that's how we're going to be doing things everywhere. So for example, in edit mode, when we have a vertex selected, if you press G, that will let us move it. If we have, for example, an edge selected, if we press R, we can rotate it, right? These are some of the most important movement tools that we have, and we should remember them, and we should use the shortcuts for them. R for rotation and G for grab. Now let's take a look at another thing. What are all these different panels in Blender? Now, your top panel right here is your object interaction and lighting panel, basically. It's the way you can use different objects. For example, you have different modes that you can select for whatever it is you're doing, and I'm not going to go into too many details. We have our different ways that Blender can be used, for example, dope sheets and UV editors and shaders and image editors, right? Timeline drivers. We're not going to touch any of it. Oh, also Python scripting. For those of you who have noticed, if you know any Python, you can run scripts in Python and Blender and even make a game if you really wanted to, and people have. You can download blend files that are literally games you can play. But all of these will access some of these. We'll access the UV editor, we'll access the shader editor slightly, and we'll go through a couple of these, but we'll mostly stay in the 3D viewport as we are right now. Now, this is where all of that is located, and this shows you your current tool selected. So if I select something else, that's where it is. It will also give you a couple of options later down the line of different things you can do to a tool, but you'll also have a little toolbar here that we can use. Now, down here are our internal modes for different viewports, I guess you can call it. We have sculpt mode, we have object mode, we have way painting mode, we have texture painting mode. We can access all of these here, and I'll be pointing out whenever we access one that we're specifically clicking on this button right there. And right here are our dropdowns. So normally you have file, edit, and stuff like that up here, and we always have these available. But because different modes actually have different dropdowns, sculpt mode has different dropdowns from edit mode and object mode. They're relocated right here, and there's a lot of features in them that we won't cover, but there's quite a few of them that are going to be extremely useful to us, especially when we're downloading meshes from files, and they might be a little bit iffy here and there. This section we will go over in a lot of detail down the line, but this revolves around transformations and actually editing meshes, as it can be done in two ways. It can be done in edit mode, and it can be done in sculpt mode, and this will help us do that. And here we have our shading and viewport options. For example, we can set wireframes, turn on wireframes, and if I subdivide this, we can continue seeing all of the outlines even in object mode. And if we go ahead and disable wireframe, we can't see it anymore, but the object is divided. That's going to be useful here and there just for visibility's sake, and there's a bunch of options in here that you can take a look at, like face orientation. Will be useful later down the line, not at the moment. Then we also have our X-ray mode. Alt-Z activates X-ray mode, and I'm well aware that NVIDIA Shadow Play, or whatever it's called, activates with that. I usually just click it because I'm too lazy to rebind it, and I already remember the key for it, and I don't know. And then we have our wireframe view, we have our simple shaded view, we have our Eevee shaded view, which is lit. This is going to display all your textures and whatnot, and it will give you some kind of a lit up environment that you can choose. As you can see, we can switch between a few of them, and this is going to be your full shaded view. Now, the full shaded view requires a light. For example, if I turn off the light here, you can see that our object becomes completely dark because it needs light. We're almost never going to go into this mode unless we're going to be taking some pictures or whatnot or doing renders. But this mode's useful for checking out your textures and how they look. This mode is useful for having something like random selected and having different materials display as just random colors, and it's all uniform and nicely visible. And this mode is not useful at all 95% of the time. So we're not going to worry about it too much. So these are our main tools up here. Here we have our hierarchy. Hierarchies are going to be very useful once we start working with armatures and once we start having more than one material on an object. So for example, if I create another cube and move it down somewhere, you can see we have another cube created, and it's all going to display here, and we can rename things and delete things and whatnot in this menu here. We can also hide things in the same menu by clicking the little I button. Another button that's useful to remember is the H key for hide. So if I select an object of some sort, like our new cube that we created, if I press H, it does exactly the same thing as clicking the I, and it simply hides it. So this is going to be really important for organization and for having a visual representation of where things are attached to on the model itself. And we'll be taking a good look at it once we do get around to actually importing a model into Blender. Now, last but not least, we have our big window here with a lot of different options. A lot of these are going to be completely useless to us. For example, rendering options here, render properties, we're never going to use those. You can learn about them and they're very cool. And those cool videos that you see online of people having like glass and whatnot, they come here for their final adjustments. But we're not going to be using them, as well as our outputs and our layers and whatever this is, because I've never used it. I'm pretty sure this is for physics generation and whatnot, and just certain scene creation and world lighting and whatnot. We're never going to touch these. These are completely useless to us. Our collections are potentially useful. We might come in to take a look at them, but in most cases, not really. There's just a couple of things, a couple of options that you can select here, and but that's all for personal preference. You can take a look at what they do if you simply hover over them. Now, this is going to be a very useful tool for us. This controls our visibility of different objects. For example, we can turn this object wireframe. Now this is going to be more useful for bones and stuff like that, but we'll have quite a few options in here that we actually play around with, like relations is going to be something that we're going to be using, and visibility is going to be something that we'll be touching here and there. This will also display our transforms that our object has gone through, and I will explain in detail why these are insanely important in Blender. But for now, these are our object properties. Let's move on. Modifiers. Modifiers are some of the most powerful tools that we have in Blender. In our case, we're only going to be touching on armature, but there's a few tools in here that we might tinker around here and there if we're doing some kind of model creation, or if we're trying to make something look better by using tools. But modifiers are very useful for non-destructive model creation instead of simply modeling everything one little dot in space at a time. These are super useful, and we might use one or two of the generate ones, but for the most part we'll be looking at the armature one here. Actually maybe shrink wrap, but we'll try to avoid shrink wrap best we can, as although it has many uses, it also has many problems, especially for models created for VRChat, which I'll explain down the line. But this little wrench is our modifiers. Next, we have our particle properties. Particles are very cool. We're never going to touch them, but particles are very cool. Physics properties. Again, it's something we're never going to touch because they're completely useless to us outside of Blender. But these are super cool, and this is how people do the fluid simulations or cloth simulations, collisions, explosions. You can do so many things with these. Then we have, I'm not even sure what this is called, object constraint properties. These are used for constraining armatures in certain ways, but these are again completely useless to us, as we'll be exporting the model to Unity, and Unity will be doing a lot of these things for us. Next down the line are our vertex groups and shape keys. These are going to be important down the line for Visemes, they'll be important down the line for custom animations, and a bunch of other stuff. They also have our normals auto smooth here, which I will show why that's very important in the future. There's a very specific issue in VRChat that exists, and it's not that hard to solve in reality, but most people don't know about this, so that's where that option's going to be. And last but not least, we have our materials. This is where we will be creating materials, where we'll be editing materials, and where we'll be removing materials in certain cases. This is also where our textures will get plugged in, and this is what's going to allow us to separate things. We'll be using materials in very, very creative ways, in ways that Blender didn't actually expect people to use materials, but we'll be using them in a fairly surprising way to help us out in quite a lot of cases. I think that about covers all of it. I think that's about it. But not, as you can see, 3 or 4 out of all of these we're never going to touch. So, and all of these are going to be completely useless to us, and so are these going to be completely useless to us for specifically model creation in VRChat. Now, these will change depending on what you're doing. For example, in sculpt mode, we'll have some functions that we can have for actually sculpting and whatnot for a tool. Now we can also access all of these functions here, but we'll have them here, and in edit mode we'll have one less function here. We won't be able to edit textures. That was the last little icon. So this will change depending on which mode you're in and what you're doing. As things stand, this is the basic introduction to how to move around Blender and what different panels are, and whether we'll be using them at all or not. But for the time being, that's what it is. One thing I forgot to mention is we also have these different tabs, and they restructure your viewport specifically for certain things that you might be doing. For example, it cleans things up for sculpting and gives you an extra thing for UV editing or for texture painting, maybe for rendering and animation, compositing, and geometry nodes, which are super, super cool. Never gonna touch them. And scripting, if you really want to, write your code somewhere. But for the most part, we're going to be staying in layout. Modeling, potentially we'll be switching to that just for a cleaner interface, and sculpting we might be switching into that simply for a cleaner interface. But I mostly stay in layout, and you'll see that I work around this. And one last little feature that you should remember about Blender is you're not just limited to these windows. As a matter of fact, if we hover over the corner where it says options, if we hover right over the corner and see our cursor turn into a little plus sign, if we click and drag, we can actually create a second window. And we can interact with these windows individually. Or for example, we can have this window in sculpt mode and this window looking at something else on the other side of sculpt mode, right? So for example, if we were dragging along this edge, right, we can drag it along here and take a look at what it might look like from this side. This will be useful for us, especially for UV editing, because we'll be able to have our model in view and be able to work on our UVs, which we'll discuss in the future, right here. And that's just very useful. And you can do the same thing from below, if it lets me. I guess not. Yeah, it's not quite letting me, but And this window down here is also that, so you can have it as a 3D viewport if you really wanted to. But in this case, I'm just gonna keep it as a timeline. Now, to merge the windows together, if we get our little arrows for moving things around and we right click, we can join areas and an arrow will pop up. This arrow joins into the area that it's pointing into. So whichever area it's pointing into is the one that's going to disappear, basically. So if we point this way, that window disappears. And if we pointed it the other way, this window would disappear and the other window would become the main window. And let's take a look at that. So if I go into UV editor and I join areas, as you can see, this becomes our main window. But we don't want to be here, we want to be in the viewport. So this is basic navigation with Blender and a few of the tools that we'll be using. The last thing, Cat's plugin is going to be pretty important, especially for people just starting out with Blender, as it will give you a lot of options specifically for MMD models, but just in general, a couple of buttons that will make things a little bit easier on you. Now, the Cat's plugin can be downloaded from the GitHub here. There's going to be a released version right here, and if we click on it, we can scroll down and download the zip. Now you can keep things as a zip for actually installing things for Blender, and I'm just gonna I should probably download it. So I'm gonna save it, and that's gonna save to my downloads. And now if I go into Blender, how do we add the Cat's plugin to our Blender, and how do we display it here? Now, the Cat's plugin, it's pretty simple to add. If we go to our edit at the top, preferences, and then add-ons, we can click the little install button here, and we can go to our downloads. And somewhere here is going to be Cat's plugin right here. And we just hit install add-on. Once Cat's plugin is installed, we find it, and then we simply check mark it, and it will be installed in our project, and we'll be able to use it. Now, I think this covers about everything as far as movement is concerned, and as far as installing our very first plugin is concerned. We'll be going into a lot more in depth into the Cat's plugin, probably third or fourth video. As there's a few things in here that are very, very useful, like eye tracking, visemes, bone parenting is quite useful, and custom model creation is fairly useful. But we'll be going through the Cat's plugin in a lot more detail, as there's quite a few things for people new to Blender that are super useful, and I'll be able to show in some cases how to do things manually instead of using the Cat's plugin in case it does break on a newer version. It happens from time to time that people who work on it can be a little bit behind the actual releases. Now that was a lot of information. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you've learned a couple of things, and I hope you can get enough out of this to practice the basic movement in Blender. Don't worry about what tools we've discussed and whatnot, because that's not too terribly important just yet. Just keep in mind that there's going to be quite a few places that we'll be accessing, quite a few things around Blender that we'll be using. Aside from that, thank you for watching. Thank you for taking your time. Like, comment. I want to know what you want to see in these videos. Where do you want to go with these videos? What kind of models you would want to create, whether it's female, male, stuff like that. All of your comments are going to be completely appreciated. As for the time being, we're just going to continue going through the basics. Again, thank you for watching. Thank you for commenting. Bye-bye.